SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Sachin Ketkar and I am from the MS University of Baroda. I teach English there, and today we are going to look at feminism and literature, and we are going to look into very basics and a kind of brief overview of this vast area. And believe me, it's one of the very fascinating areas that a student of literature can actually engage with. So let us begin by looking at our subject area, that is literature and feminism. So I want you to just look at this slide for a moment, and what it says here is feminism is a radical notion that women are people. It implies that it's something of a joke, and it implies that it's very difficult for a male dominated society to come to terms with the idea that women are also human beings, women are people. And the whole struggle of feminist movements in the past 20th century is largely about asserting themselves as human beings. So what is feminism? And how is it connected to literature? That is what we are going to discuss today. And what are the things that we are going to cover today are these. The objective of today's discussion is that the students will get a sense of what feminism is and how has it impacted literary studies. We will also have a brief overview of the history of feminism. We'll also look at some of the key feminist thinkers, some important significant texts and the critical ideas of feminism. So that is what we are going to do today. So today's discussion is largely for undergrads and some of the postgraduate students. So it is a kind of introductory basic talk on this complex subject. So let us begin by looking at what feminism is, right? And what do we mean by the term feminism? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes that feminism is both an intellectual commitment and a political movement that seeks justice for women, an end of sexism in all forms. The term sexism implies discriminatory or abusive behavior towards members of the opposite sex. And it's a very interesting term because sexism can also come from women, right? So feminism is not just about correction of male attitudes towards women, but also attitudes toward other genders and other sex. So this is a rather vast kind of definition of feminism. Let's look into it into greater detail. Feminism is a collection of movements and ideologies aimed at defining, establishing, and defending equal political, economic, and social rights for women. This includes seeking to establish equal opportunities for women in education and employment. A feminist is one who advocates or supports the right and equality of women. And here I would like to draw your attention to the fact that a feminist may not always be a woman. Feminist is a human being who advocates and supports rights and equality of women and other genders. It would sound rather curious when I talk of other genders. So we'll come to that in the part of our discussion. So this is what feminism is. It's part of social, cultural, civilizational movement which seeks to establish equal rights for women. Women who have been subordinated or discriminated or put at secondary level, considered inferior or even not human by human society. So it's a kind of liberatory movement, a freedom struggle. And this freedom struggle has its origins in the 20th century, largely as a social cultural movement. In the beginning of 20th century towards the end of 19th century. So let's look at this term in greater detail. So this is what a feminist looks like, for example. So we have been used to the idea that feminists are usually women, but this is what a feminist looks like. However, there are many different kinds of feminism. Feminism or feminist criticism is thus an umbrella term that describes a whole range of approaches to literature and culture. We have to bear in mind that feminism is not a single kind of approach or attitude or a theory. Rather, it's a kind of umbrella term that describes a whole range of approaches and theories and ideas to look at literature and human culture. So there is no one kind of feminism. There are many kinds of feminist criticisms and feminisms. So this is something that a student of feminism has to bear in mind. So here is a very famous quote by a well-known woman writer named Rebecca West. And she said, "I only know what people call me, a feminist, whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat or a prostitute." Rebecca West is implying that though there may be no one meaning of the term feminism, whenever a woman asserts herself as a human being rather than as a doormat or as a prostitute, it sounds like she is a feminist. And this will give you a sense of what feminist is or feminism is. It implies that it's about assertion of who women are, really are, instead of being defined by men, who they are. So at its heart is the quest for identity, assertion of identity as a woman. So let's look further into this subject. So if this is feminism, if feminism is a social, cultural, ideological, economical movement that seeks to establish equality of rights for women, which seeks to liberate women from male-dominated definitions and norms and conventions, which support men, then what is feminist criticism? Feminist criticism, thus, says a critic named Lois Tyson, is concerned with the ways in which literature and other cultural productions reinforce or undermine the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. So feminist criticism engages with how society, culture, economy, and all social institutions have, including literature and human language, have actually put women at margins, have neglected, have exploited, have oppressed women throughout centuries. And literature, being a social institution, it also embodies the very norms, conventions, ideas, beliefs, attitudes of the society, which is predominantly patriarchal or male dominated. So literature, like language, belongs to society. And if we just look at our languages, just consider our languages, then the words like man or manushya or manav, manas, isam, admi, insan, all seems to imply male gender, and it doesn't seem to include the other gender. So language itself seems to claim that male or masculine gender seems to be the absolute or ultimate kind of gender, and other genders are actually subordinate or even excluded from what it means to be human. So patriarchy by definition seems to exclude women when it starts thinking on its important issues. So literature, which is part of society, and society which is basically patriarchal, such literature would also embody those values. So feminist literary criticism would actually seek to analyze, decode, and question and challenge these values embodied in literary text. This school of theory looks at how aspects of our culture are inherently patriarchal, that is male dominated. And this critique strives to expose the explicit and implicit misogyny. Misogyny is hatred or dislike for women in male writing about women. So when we look at literary texts written by men, they often embody values which are patriarchal, which means they seek either to subordinate, exclude women, or represent or talk about them in stereotypical ways, in fixed ways which are not real. Consider that a representation of women in Indian society and the ideals which are upheld for women in Indian society are like those of Sita, right? The ideals which are decided by men about what an ideal woman should be. And that is where the trouble begins, because real women, like real men, do not actually conform to any stereotypical representation. So feminism seeks to question these gender stereotypes in literary text. It also questions the attitudes and the values that literary tradition seems to embody. Here is a very interesting statement by a noted activist called Helene Gayle, and she says, "You can't marginalize more than half of the globe's population and expect to see any meaningful solutions to the problems that ail the world today." And that's what patriarchy does. Patriarchy seems to believe that women either do not exist or do not count, or if they count, they are just there as tokens. And this is the system of values, beliefs, ideas which feminism seeks to challenge. So let's move ahead. So as I have said, that there are many approaches which go under the name of feminism. There is no single school of feminism. But there are some common overlapping areas. There are some points which are common to most of these approaches based on feminism. The first very important idea is women are oppressed by patriarchy in economically, politically, socially, psychologically. They are oppressed. Patriarchal ideology is the primary means by which they are kept so. So patriarchal ideology or patriarchal way of thinking and believing and looking at the world is one which actually relegates women to secondary status. They are not considered human, they are considered subhuman. The another very important point where all feminist thinking seems to converge is that in every domain where patriarchy reigns, woman is other. She is marginalized, defined only by her difference from male norms and values. Woman is one who seems to embody everything that male or man doesn't. She is considered to be secondary. She is considered to be inferior or negative kind of man. She is inferior human being because she is different from man. That is a very deep-seated idea in a patriarchal society. all of Western, that is Anglo-European civilization, is deeply rooted in patriarchal ideology. For example, in the biblical portrayal of Eve as the origin of sin and death of the world. Consider even Eastern civilization like India. The representation of women is usually in terms of either goddess Sati or as a devil, Sita or Shurpanakha. She is never considered to be human. She is always considered to be either goddess or a kind of female devil. So patriarchy, what it basically does is that it refuses to accept the idea that women are human. So that is what patriarchy basically means. Another overlapping point, another common point which underlies all feminist thinking, and this is extremely important for us, is while biology determines our sex, that is, we are male or female biologically, anatomically, culture, our society, determines our gender, which is masculine or feminine. This polarity between gender and sex is extremely critical to feminist thinking. So let us think a little bit more about that. Why is gender culturally determined? And one of the common evidence for that would be that every society has different norms about how man or woman should be. Every culture has different definitions, conventions about what is manliness or femininity. So what might be feminine in certain societies may not be accepted as feminine in other society, which proves that though biologically all women and